Hello and welcome to our next lesson in our survey of Genesis. This is lesson number 16 and I've titled it Homeward Bound with a little question mark, part 1. So this lesson and the next are going to be talking about Jacob and his move back towards Canaan. If you remember from the last lesson we left off, God had spoken to Jacob and said, it's time to head home. It's time to head home where your kindred live and the promised land that I promised to your grandfather Abraham. So Jacob is headed home. Just a little bit of context as we're trying to do, kind of keep in mind where Jacob is in his life. Jacob leaving Laban or fleeing from Laban to head towards Canaan. He's 97 years old, right? So he showed up in Haran when he was 77. Did 14 years of service in order to earn his 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and then an additional 6 years of service to Laban as he worked out the whole which sheep in the flock are mine versus yours situation. But at this point, with the way that things have evolved, God said it's time for you to head home. Jacob recognizes that the relations between him and Laban are strained at best, and so it's time to go, right? But at a 97-year-old man making that 500-mile journey. The other thing we introduced in the last lesson was just this pictorial about Jacob's family and the complexities associated with that. He has 11 sons from his 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and their handmaids that were given to Jacob as wives as well, Zilpah and Bilhah. 1 son left to be born, Benjamin, and then a daughter, Dinah. And we talked in the last lesson about how the world might perceive this family. Lots of success here, 11 sons, that's amazing. That's got to be a blessing. 1 daughter who's got to be the princess of the family, and how that would have been, by the world's standard anyway, have been perceived as blessings piling on Jacob. And of course, there are blessings piling on Jacob. And we know that God is working in the lives of Rachel and Leah, and he's working in Jacob's life, even though their relationship between God and Jacob isn't evident to us that it's a vibrant and thriving relationship. We don't know necessarily if it is or isn't, but the Bible doesn't really indicate a lot of interaction. Don't see Jacob praying a lot to God. You don't see God working in Jacob's life until he shows up and says to Jacob, you need to head home. So from a spiritual perspective, lots of challenges here, right? Rivalry among the wives, sibling rivalry, at least the stage is set for that. You've got a passive father that, even in the lesson today, you're going to see is less decisive than you would think that he might be, especially when God's given him specific instructions. You've got Laban, who's a conniving father-in-law, and his other sons that are the uncles to Jacob's family, his children. So, we ask ourselves, how can God work through this messy situation? And of course, we know God is able to work through any situation. And maybe even messy situations are where he works the best, to show his power and glory, where you would look at something and say, I just don't know how that's going to possibly work out according to God's plan. God finds a way. So let's remember where we pick up where we left off in the last lesson. That Jacob recognizes that things aren't going well with Laban, and the Lord, Yahweh, has said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and here's a promise, I will be with you. So not only does he have instructions to Jacob to head toward Canaan, but he makes him a promise and says, I'll be with you on that journey. So we have that promise. Remember that the journey from where he started, down here where Isaac and Rebekah are living in this area of Hebron and Beersheba, way down south, just on the western side of the Dead Sea, where the Dead Sea is now, right? And this would have been the area where just a few years earlier, Sodom and Gomorrah would have been destroyed. So not exactly sure what the geography of this area is at this time, but if you think about the current Levant area, they're down here. And he made this 500-mile journey up to Haran at the instruction of his father Isaac. And so now, as he heads back, he's going to effectively retrace his steps, right? He's got to go all the way from up here the top of present-day Turkey, through Syria, down through Lebanon, back to where his family is in Canaan, right? So that's going to be the trip. And so here's how Jacob is going to set out. The first thing that he's going to do is he's gathering Rachel and Leah for a family conference. And he's going to tell them what God has told him. He says to them, first off, I see that your father does not regard me with favor as he did before. Okay? Recognizing what everybody probably knows, which is that there's a dysfunction there and that there's a falling out that's occurred, and frankly, Laban and his sons are jealous and envious of what Jacob has accomplished and what he's put together. And the whole sheep experiment with Laban and his sons getting the supposedly best sheep that are pure white, and Jacob taking the spotted and speckled and the black sheep, has worked very much in Jacob's favor, not only because Jacob, in my opinion, sort of asked God to bless his plan and use the sticks as a sort of prayer, but also because Jacob's been smart about how he's bred the sheep. But then also Jacob remembers to give God the credit, right? But the God of my father, Isaac, has been with me. And it also says that Jacob believes that God has been behind not allowing Laban to harm him. In fact, that he's been blessed. And he reminds Leah and Rachel about his plan around the sheep and how God has blessed this plan. In fact, we actually get a little bit more detail. And one of the reasons that I think that the stick situation is a kind of prayer is because Jacob gives us a little bit more color. We don't know exactly when God is talking to Jacob about this, but Jacob says that God's responsible for this, and that as part of this interaction with God, it says, in the breeding season of the flock, I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the goats that mated with the flock were striped and spotted and mottled. And then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob says, here I am. And he said, lift up your eyes and see. All the goats that mate with the flocks are striped and spotted and mottled, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. So God's responding to Jacob's request or his plan and blessing it. So maybe that puts a sort of fine point on the whole plan that Jacob had. And then this reminder in the dream that Jacob had where he says, I am the God of Bethel. So he's calling Jacob to remember back to that commitment that Jacob made and the vow that he made. And he said, remember, you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise and go out from this land and return to the land of your kindred. Notice the subtle difference in what God actually said to Jacob versus what Jacob says to Rachel and Leah. He tells them that God said, go out from this land and return to the land of your kindred, which is what God said. But he left the part out about and to your kindred, right? So just a subtle difference, maybe a little telephone game kind of problem here, whereas Jacob relays the news to Rachel and Leah, drops out a point that he may have in his mind, but doesn't necessarily pass that along to them. And then in the family conference, Rachel and Leah are finally on the same page on this. They respond as one, and they say to him, look, we really don't have anything here. Whatever we had that would have been coming to us, our father has squandered. It says, I think, devoured. Is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. So they're saying, look, there's nothing here for us anyway. Whatever we have is because of you, Jacob, and it's all within our family. And remember that family tree that we said, they're thinking this is our home, wherever this family is, right? And they give credit to God for what they have. God is responsible for their wealth. And so they basically say to Jacob, look, whatever God told you to do, that's what you should do. Which Jacob should already know that, right? He doesn't really need Rachel and Leah to tell him that whatever God said to him, he should do. But he does have the affirmation, so his wives and he are on the same page that now's the time to go for him back to Canaan, for Rachel and Leah to this place that they've never been, where they will be foreigners, not just feel like foreigners. But they're on the same page. They're going to do what God says to do. So Jacob is acting decisive at this point, right? God said it's time to go. He gets Rachel and Leah on the same page. They get everybody packed up, and they're going to head southwest, and they're going to do it quickly, right? So they head for the big river. The Euphrates is going to be the river that they're going to have to cross, which is no small thing when you've got thousands of livestock and all your family and all your belongings and all the hired hands that you have. They're going to move a big group across a big river, right? So no small thing. And then you have this little incident where Rebekah sneaks back over to Laban's tents and steals from Laban the household gods, the idols that they have in their tents. Okay, doesn't say why. Is it to spite her father? Obviously Rachel and Leah are kind of bitter about the fact that whatever they viewed as their inheritance was squandered or devoured, and all that they have is what God has delivered, which is plenty. Was it to spite her father? Was it to claim some inheritance, to get the gold, the value of the gold and the idols or whatever they were made with? Or was it Rebekah's attempt to keep a little piece of her culture? Because remember, she's going to be traveling to a foreign land she's never been to. And I kind of think it's probably more like, I want a little piece of my culture to go with me wherever I'm going. And she chose that to be these idols. And whether they were to her some sort of a memory or something to remember the culture by, or whether she's actually saying, you know what, I'm kind of going to hang on to some of these gods because I don't know whether I can fully trust Yahweh. I don't really know. It doesn't say her motive. But something motivated her to go actually do this, to steal these household gods away from Laban. And so Jacob kind of turns the tables on Laban. He tricks him. It says tricked, right? So he's going to not give him any indication that he's headed out, and he's going to leave. What Rachel does is going to cause a big problem, as we're about to see, and in fact may even have implications beyond just the interaction between Laban and Jacob. But Laban hears about the departure, right? So 3 days after they've packed up and headed towards the Euphrates and crossed the Euphrates, Laban hears about it and says that he's going to pursue, perhaps even the same day. So it may be that 3 days have passed and they're going to get up and they're going to head towards that group. They're going to be not taking a bunch of livestock and possessions and tents, so they can move a whole lot faster than Jacob, you would think. And as Laban is pursuing him, this is really interesting, it says that God intervenes and actually speaks to Laban in a dream and says that he is not to harm Jacob, right? So God comes and says, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Well, that's some very specific instruction. And so Laban clearly has an understanding of who Yahweh is. Remember in the last lesson, it says that he, through divination, understands that Yahweh's been responsible for the things that he has. So God intervenes, warns Laban, be careful what you say, right? And so we want to know the question right now, where is Jacob? So if Laban's setting out, after at least a 3-day head start, and they're going to go chase after him, then where is Jacob when they're going to catch up to him, right? And there's two possibilities, because it's going to indicate in Scripture that Jacob set his tents up in the hill country of Gilead. And Gilead is both a specific place and also sort of a general reference to an area. So if you look at when they're starting up in Haran, crossing the Euphrates River and heading southwest, going through present-day Syria, the hill country of Gilead was really a region that stretched almost all the way from where Jerusalem is in the northern part of the Transjordan area. So here's the Jordan River. So this whole area from south of the Sea of Galilee, which is right in there, all the way up through into Lebanon and southern Syria. This is all a very mountainous, hilly area with a plain on the side transitioning into the desert. This could be all considered Gilead, which really just meant east of the Jordan. So anything east of the Jordan is Gilead from a region perspective. But there's also a place called Gilead, and ultimately when we read about the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites, this particular area is mentioned, and in fact, 2 tribes are going to receive that land. That's a very specific area that is basically from just southeast of the Sea of Galilee down to the middle part of the Holy Lands, right? So it could be that Jacob has made it all the way down to right just east of the Sea of Galilee in 10 days or around 10 days. If you look at the 3 days plus the 7 it took for Laban to catch up. One of the reasons that we think maybe he's actually all the way down here is there's a river right here called the Jabbok River, and it's going to be mentioned in chapter 32. So whether he's already there or whether he gets there in chapter 32, this is where Jacob's going to be camped out. So he's already quite a bit of the way back. And so Laban, when he catches up to him, is far from home. So the tables are kind of reversed. Laban's going to be in the foreign land, right? So that's kind of where the next part of this story takes place. And when Laban gets to when Laban gets to Jacob, he's had some time to really think about this and it's kind of worked up a set of grievances. He's probably been thinking about exactly how he's going to approach Jacob. And so he's going to present to him 2 grievances. The first is, why did you just in the middle of the night slip out the back door without telling anybody about it? Because if you would have said it's time to head home, we would have thrown a big party. And you robbed me of the chance to throw that big party and have a celebration and give you a send-off that you really deserve for all of the things that you've done for me, right? All right, that really sounds like something Laban would do, is to throw a big send-off party when there's really nothing in it for him. Yes, it's one thing to throw a big wedding feast when you know you're going to receive Jacob's service in response. But nevertheless, that's this first thing, is you robbed us of a chance to have a big party, and we love to have big parties. And then the second grievance is that he says, and you stole my household gods, my idols, which is an accusation, not just a grievance, right? And so that's what he presents to Jacob. And first off, Jacob kind of blows off the party idea. He says, look, I left because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters from me by force. That's a reasonable assumption on Jacob's part. That if Jacob says, look, I'm leaving, that it's very likely that Laban would have said, all right, I'm going to get all my sons, they're going to help me, we're going to take all of your sheep, the spotted, the speckled, the black sheep, we're going to take the daughters and my grandsons and my granddaughter, and you can head back to Canaan, but they're staying here. That is a valid assumption on Jacob's part that he would try to do that. And then Jacob says this about the whole accusation on the idols. Anyone with whom you find your God shall not live. So Jacob's going to pronounce a curse that says, look, hey, come on in and you go do your investigation. See if you can find your idols. If you find them, whoever stole them shall not live. So he pronounces a curse on the person that stole the idols. Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. So Jacob's going to conduct a search. Jacob's going to allow Laban to conduct a search and look in all the tents and look wherever he wants to look. And if he finds those idols, then whoever is responsible is going to be punished with a death penalty. That's what Jacob has said. So you have this interesting little scene where Laban's going tent to tent, probably starts in Jacob's tent, and he's rummaging around and he's looking. And he goes into Rachel's tent finally. And he finds Rachel. And Rachel's apparently using the saddle from her camel as kind of a chase lounge. So she's on the saddle, right? And she's in a delicate way. She claims to be on her period. And so she says, I can't rise to greet you, Father, because I'm in the way of women. I'm in this delicate situation. So don't be angry that I can't rise to greet you. And so she basically sets up a scene where Laban can't, without being very awkward and inappropriate, do much searching besides just her tent. And so she's hidden the idols in the saddle. She's on the saddle, reclining on the saddle. The saddle doesn't get searched. The idols aren't found. Okay? It's interesting to think about what would have happened if the idols would have been found in Rachel's tent, because Jacob would have been forced to confront his curse, and whether he would have defended Rachel or he would have said, well, I said what I said, death penalty for Rachel. It's also really interesting to think if Jacob's curse doesn't come back around and have consequences for Rachel later on. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that might be. But we know that ultimately Rachel dies while giving birth to the last son, Benjamin. And is it possible that in some respect, what Jacob says here about the punishment for the stealing of the idols doesn't actually come around as a consequence, which would be very sad if that's true. So how is Laban going to respond to this? He's got a choice to make. Jacob's got a choice to make. When we come back, we're going to take a look at that choice. So Laban, having not found the idols, comes back to Jacob. And at this point, it's Jacob's turn to be a little irate. It says Jacob became angry and berated Laban. It's interesting to think about Laban being in a position where God has told him, be careful what you say to Jacob, for good or for bad. You have to be careful what you say to Jacob. And now Jacob's going to have to hear from, or Laban's going to have to hear from Jacob. And Jacob says to Laban, what is my offense? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? I'm moving this group, of people across back home, and you've jumped on with your group and raced across the plains to find me. What is it that I did that warranted that kind of response? And Jacob then calls sort of a family council together to say, let's have our kinsmen come around and we're going to judge your grievances, especially the one having to do with the idols, right? And Jacob's going to, in this family council format, remind Laban of where he's gotten his wealth in the first place, right? That what Laban has is a result of the blessings that Jacob has enjoyed. He says, these 20 years I've been with you, your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, and I've not eaten the rams of your flock. So he's been a good steward. He said, what's torn by wild beasts I did not bring to you. Took care of that myself, bore the loss myself. So he's telling Laban, you know that the wealth that you have is because of my hard work and the blessings of Yahweh. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac, right? So the one true God that deserves respect and honor and fear had not been on my side, recognizing that he's saying there's two sides here, right? There's your side and there's my side. If he had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands, and he rebuked you last night. Which is interesting. It doesn't say that Laban disclosed to Jacob that Yahweh had talked to him, but Jacob clearly knows that he had. And so Jacob's reminding Laban here that really God's already settled the matter. God's already shown whose side he's on, and he's already spoken to Laban. And so Laban knows full well that Jacob's right, that everything they have collectively is a response from God and a blessing to both Laban and Jacob. And he should have been happy with the blessings that he received, given God the credit, worshiped, sacrificed, all those things, instead of continuing to, as has been his habit, to always grasp for more and more and more, including trying to take what he perceived to be his back from Jacob, which is exactly what he says to Jacob. He says, "The daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine." So he's telling Jacob, look around, everything that you see is really mine. These daughters, these handmaids, these grandchildren of mine, all of these flocks, I think they're mine. That's my claim, okay? But he says, what can I do this day for these my daughters or for their children whom they've borne? In other words, you know what? I'm really not in a position to do anything about it. I'm way far away from home. Yahweh, your God, has talked to me through a dream and said I'm not to do anything. So he's conceding the point. You know what? Even though I'm making this claim, I'm saying there's really nothing I can do about it. And so he proposes a covenant, which is really interesting. He says, let's draw up a covenant. And the points of the covenant are twofold. First, he's going to ask Jacob to promise that he's not going to oppress his daughters. He's not going to mistreat Leah and Rachel. He may have a reason for doing this. He may have seen Jacob in the way that he responded to his wives, preferring Rachel to Leah and causing Leah pain and suffering, emotional, and seeing friction between Rachel and Jacob, which we saw in our last lesson. So he may have a really good reason for looking after his daughters. And if so, we see at least a bit of good character within Laban. And then the second thing is Laban says, look, we're basically going to need to agree that my part of this big area of the Levant is mine, and your part's yours, and we're going to agree not to cross over and cause each other harm. So we're dividing up, which I think is a little arrogant on their part, but nevertheless, that's what they do. This big part of the region's mine, this part's yours, and we're going to agree not to mess with each other. And so Jacob responds immediately, and by his actions agrees to this idea of making a covenant. And he's going to get one stone and set it up as a pillar. And then he's going to instruct his kinsman, presumably his brothers-in-law, to go get multiple stones and create a heap. So imagine the scene is you have one stone, this pillar, and then you have a big pile of stones over here. We're presuming that the one stone represents the witness of the one true God, of Yahweh. And so Jacob is saying, here's a spiritual witness, Yahweh, my God. And then for you guys, here's your spiritual witness, which is all your many false gods. And so you've got that visual. And so you've got spiritual witness to the covenant. And both men agree, because of the way this is set up and what they agreed to do, that they're going to be spiritually accountable for the covenant. In fact, Isaac repeats that he swears by the fear of his father Isaac, and the fear is capitalized. This is talking about God, another name for Yahweh, fear. So he swears by Yahweh, and we presume they swear by their gods, if not outright, then at least that's what the meaning of this whole scene is, right? Jacob swears by Yahweh, they swear by their gods. And then it says Jacob continues and offers a sacrifice to further cement the covenant that he has gone into. And having done that, having arrived at that agreement, with no bloodshed and nobody stealing anybody's sheep and the idols not being found, it then says, early in the morning, Laban arose and kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them in whatever form that he did. And then Laban departed and returned home, back up to Haran. And as far as we know, that's the last we hear from Laban. So Laban goes back home, and then Isaac needs to continue on his journey to move back to Canaan and to respond to God's specific message. So we move into chapter 32, and it's an interesting account where Jacob, as he's moving towards Canaan from this area of Gilead, that he has this meeting with angels or messengers of God. It says Jacob went on his way, and the angels or messengers of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp right here." And so he called the name of that place Mahanaim, which means two camps, which is really interesting. So this is very similar to the situation at Bethel when Jacob met the angel of God there. And his response is similar, recognizing this is a special place, this is God's place. The two camps is interesting. Maybe he's making reference back to Bethel, where the same kind of thing happened, and saying this is the second camp, Bethel, and Mahanaim, right? If I'm pronouncing that correctly. So two camps, those two. Or perhaps Jacob is taking it as a sign of how he's to proceed with this encounter with Esau. The thing that's probably been really wearing on him is this, I'm going to ultimately meet Esau. How's that going to go? He told me that he was going to kill me, right? So it could be that he's taking this as a sign that God is saying, two camps, you need to have two camps. Regardless of how he perceives it, which of the way, there is an approach that he's going to take, right? So he sends messengers down to where Esau lives, and Esau is living down in the very southern part of that Levant area on the eastern side of where the Dead Sea is now. The area is called Edom, and Edom is actually named for Esau, so I don't know if it's called Edom right now, but ultimately that's the area that's going to be called Edom. That's where Esau lives. So Jacob sends messengers down there to say, hey, we're coming home. So your servant Jacob says, I have sojourned with Laban. He stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants, female servants. I've sent to tell my Lord in order that I might find favor in your sight. So he sends his emissaries to talk to Esau, say, I'm coming home. I've got a lot of stuff, gifts, and I want to find favor in your sight. And then the messengers come back and they say, we gave your message to Esau, and Esau's coming to see you, and he's got 400 men with him, which sounds an awful lot like an army. And Jacob responds like any normal man would respond, which is that he freaks out and he's afraid. And he starts to go into contingency planning mode because 400 men doesn't sound like, a welcoming party. It sounds an awful lot like an army. So it makes us kind of think, what do you think Jacob thought when God said, I will be with you? Did he think in his mind that God's going to be with him through anything? He's going to be with him through an attack from a large army? Or that God's going to be with him in some sort of general way, like to show him the way to where he needs to go? I don't know. A decisive Jacob would have confidence in his God to protect him from whatever is coming. Jacob comes up with a plan B. And his plan on the surface is admirable because he's looking to protect at least a portion of his family by dividing them up into two camps. And so that's his plan. That's what he's going to do. Before he does that, Jacob takes this time to pray. And I kind of wish that during this entire story that we've been through over the past 3 lessons that Jacob would have prayed more. And like I said, maybe he did and we just don't have it recorded, but he stops and he pauses to pray, which is a really good instinct on his part, right? That's exactly what he should do. He should be praying for protection and for strength and for courage, right? But he doesn't ask for strength and courage and protection. He prays and he reminds God of what God already knows. He reminds God of the promises that God's already given to Jacob. Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I'm not worthy of the least of the deeds of steadfast love and the faithfulness you've shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan the first time, and now I've become 2 camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good, and make your offspring of the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. So Jacob's taking this opportunity to tell God, look, you promised me you'd take care of me. God doesn't really need to be reminded. What Jacob should be doing is reminding himself and all of those around him what God had said. These things that Jacob says are true. God did say those things. But rather than trying to remind God, he should be reminding himself, and he should be reminding everyone else. Don't worry, don't be anxious. God's got this. He's going to take care of us. But he prepares his plan B, which is two-part. One is plan A is to send a lot of goods to Esau as an offer, as an appeasement, to say, I want to reconcile, and here's a bunch of valuable stuff that I'm providing for you as a token of my desire, right? He prepares these gifts of appeasement. And the stage is set where you've got Jacob dividing his party up into two camps, sending an emissary group to meet Esau on the way. Esau and 400 men that are coming up from the south. The emissaries are going to meet him with all of this stuff that he's sending, right? He's sending 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 ewes, 20 rams, 30 milking camels for their calves, 40 cows, 10 bulls, 20 female goats, 10 male donkeys. He handed them over to their servants. So you've got this party coming down with all these gifts, with all this stuff to meet Esau. And then Jacob's up in the hill country, having sent half of his family and the rest of the livestock with Rachel, and the other half and the livestock with Leah. And he's saying, look, if the army's going to come attack, then at least maybe only one of my camps would be destroyed and the other will survive. And then Jacob's going to sit back and see how events unfold. So that's what we call a cliffhanger. We're at the end of the lesson. This is how this is all teed up. What's going to happen? Is the army going to attack? Is Esau going to accept the presents? Does Esau even care about presents? Well, to find out the answer to that, you have to come back to the same bat time and the same bat channel, and we'll pick up where we left off in the next lesson. But for this one, what are some truths that we can take away from these two chapters, 31 and 32? We're only part the way through 32. The first 5 are the ones we've kind of been taking from all of these lessons, which is we should not presume that man's way is God's way. God has his perfect plan, and we're not always going to know what that is, especially in the moment. But one thing we should know is that God doesn't need man's way in order to accomplish his plan. And he'll work his plan with us when we allow him. He'll work it through us when we allow him. He'll work his plan despite us if we're not cooperating, if we're in the way. We can and should learn from the successes and failures of all those who precede us, our Bible heroes, our brothers and sisters that surround us, even the folks that we see making big mistakes, headline mistakes, News 6 kind of mistakes. We can learn and should learn from those. The human perspective is often superficial, but godly perspective is spiritual. Specific to this lesson, we should be really careful the vows that we take and the curses that we make. That Jesus actually comes out and says that very specifically. If you take a vow or make a curse, that's a serious thing. And it could turn out in ways that you never even thought about or predicted. So we have to be really careful about vows and curses. We do not need to remind God of his promises. If we're going to pray to God and we're saying, hey, remember, you said you'd be with me, you promised that you would take care of me. These are things that we don't need to remind God of. And if we find ourselves doing that, thinking that we're in a position of bringing God's attention to something that's lapsed, then we're foolish. But we should absolutely remind ourselves of his promises over and over and over again. The promises that he makes in the Bible to protect us and take care of us and deliver us, that we should call on his name. All the promises that he has made to us and the doors that he's opened in front of us, that we should be asking for strength and courage to do the things that He has asked us to do. Those are reminders that we need. If God is with us, we must trust that He will actually be with us. He said He's going to be with us. And so at moments when we are tempted to be afraid, we should actually remember that He is really with us and He will deliver us. Ultimately, even if that deliverance means He delivers us to our home in heaven, we have that promise, and there's no greater promise that we have. And then the last thing is, contingency plans can be good. There's nothing wrong with having a plan B or a plan C, especially in this life when nothing's guaranteed. That can be a sign of wisdom, that I'm not just trusting in my first plan, but I've got some fallback plans that I'm thinking about. Unless we trust our fallback plans more than we trust God. If our hope is in our plan B or in our plan C, then we are hopeless. God is our ultimate hope, which doesn't mean that we can't plan and we can't have a plan B, but the plan B needs to still be within God's will and God's plan. And ultimately, our plan B is really God's plan A, which is, I'm here for you, I've given my son for you, I'm going to bring you home to live with me, just trust in me. For our next lesson, read the rest of chapter 32 and all of 33, and we'll see how this cliffhanger is going to work out.